The year is
Fuel pressure is nominal.
1985.
Control.
A December evening in Washington,
Still think you
D.C.,
can make it fly,
snow
engineer?
falls softly outside the windows of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where an old man stands alone before a bronze plaque mounted on a polished mahogany wall. His name is James Mitchell. He is 59 years old. His hair has turned completely white. His hands tremble slightly with age, and his eyes carry the weight of memories that span more than 4 decades. Behind him, the museum has closed for the night. The security guard, recognizing the name on the special access pass, has given him this moment of solitude. James reaches out and touches the cold metal of the plaque. His fingers trace the words etched into bronze: the Chrysler 112220 engine, when car makers dared to dream of the sky. But that is not the whole story. That is not even close to the whole story. James pulls a small tape recorder from his coat pocket. He presses the record button, and in a voice roughened by age but steady with purpose, he begins to speak. In 1944, my father brought a German into America's most secret weapons facility. This man had once built engines for Adolf Hitler. The FBI wanted to arrest him. The army wanted to interrogate him. But my father did something that no one expected. James pauses. The tape recorder hums softly in the silence. He gave that German the keys to the entire project. Why would an American engineer in the middle of a war against Germany trust an enemy with his life's work? Why would he risk his career, his reputation, his family's safety for a man who had served the Nazi regime? The answer to that question changed everything I believed about enemies, about family, and about what it truly means to be American. James turns away from the plaque and walks slowly toward a display case in the corner. Inside, behind protective glass, sits a scale model of an aircraft engine. It is massive, even in miniature. Gleaming cylinders arranged in a V formation. Intricate cooling pipes winding like silver veins. A masterpiece of engineering that the world has largely forgotten. This is the 11th 2220, the most powerful piston aircraft engine ever built. Created by a car company, perfected by a German refugee, flown by a Texas cowboy, and witnessed by a 17-year-old boy with a movie camera. That boy was me. James settles into a chair near the display. The museum is silent except for the distant hum of climate control systems. Outside, the capital city glitters with Christmas lights. Inside, an old man prepares to journey back through time. To understand what happened, you need to understand the world we lived in. You need to understand the fear. December 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack killed over 2,000 Americans in a single morning. The next day, we were at war with Japan. 3 days later, Germany declared war on us. Suddenly, America was fighting on two fronts against enemies who had been preparing for years. Our military was not ready. Our factories were still making cars and refrigerators. Our young men were still going to baseball games and dancing to swing music. And our aircraft were inferior to the German Luftwaffe in almost every measurable way. The problem was speed. German fighter planes were faster than ours. They could climb higher, dive steeper, and outmaneuver our pilots in dogfights. And the reason came down to one thing. Engines. American planes used radial engines, big round air-cooled engines that stuck out from the nose of the aircraft like the face of a bulldog. They were reliable. They were powerful, but they were also bulky. All that exposed metal created drag. It slowed our planes down. German planes used inline engines, sleek, narrow, liquid-cooled engines that fit inside the nose like a bullet. They were more complex, more temperamental, but they were faster, much faster. By early 1942, Washington was desperate. The War Department approached every major aircraft engine manufacturer in America. Pratt & Whitney, Wright Aeronautical, Continental. They all said the same thing. Developing a new inline engine would take 5 to 7 years. We did not have 5 to 7 years. We might not even have 5 to 7 months. Then someone had a crazy idea. What if we asked the car companies? It sounds absurd now. It sounded absurd then. Car engines and aircraft engines are fundamentally different machines. A car engine might produce 200 horsepower. A fighter plane needs 2,000. The tolerances are different. The materials are different. The cooling systems, the fuel delivery, the ignition timing, everything is different. But car companies had one thing that aircraft manufacturers did not. They knew how to build things fast. They knew mass production. They knew how to take a design from blueprint to factory floor in months instead of years. So the War Department went to Detroit. They approached Ford first. Ford said no, too risky, too far outside their expertise. They approached General Motors. GM said they would think about it. They're probably still thinking about it. Then they approached Chrysler. My father was sitting in his office on the third floor of the Chrysler engineering building when the call came. He was 50 years old, salt and pepper hair, hands calloused from 30 years of turning wrenches and building engines. He had started as a factory worker at 16 and worked his way up to chief engineer through nothing but talent and stubbornness. Harold Mitchell was not a man who believed in impossible. When General Theodore Morrison arrived in Detroit with a folder marked "Top Secret" and a proposal that would change our family's lives, my father listened without interrupting. He studied the preliminary designs. He asked questions that made the general's aides scramble for answers. And when Morrison finally asked if Chrysler could build a 2,500 horsepower aircraft engine, in 3 years my father gave an answer that would become legend in our family. Give me the right people, and I will do it in 2. The general stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. Mr. Mitchell, you have yourself a project. The project was designated XI-2220. The X stood for experimental, the I stood for inline, and 2220 was the displacement in cubic inches. It was to be a monster of an engine. 2 V8 blocks joined together at the center through a reduction gear system. 16 cylinders, liquid-cooled, more powerful than anything that had ever flown. My father assembled a team of the best engineers at Chrysler. They set up a secret facility in Chicago, away from the main Detroit operations, where they could work without interference. They brought in machinists, metallurgists, test pilots, and specialists from every field imaginable. But there was one person my father needed more than anyone else, and that person was not American. His name was Klaus Hartmann. In 1936, Klaus Hartmann was considered one of the finest engineers in Europe. He worked for BMW Flugmotorenbau, the aircraft engine division of BMW in Munich. The Germans called him the Wizard of the Piston. He had designed cooling systems that were years ahead of anything else in the world. His innovations had helped make the Luftwaffe the most formidable air force on Earth. But Klaus had a secret. His mother was Jewish. For years, the Nazi regime overlooked this fact. Klaus was too valuable. His work was too important. He was protected by powerful men who cared more about winning wars than about racial purity. Then came Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, November 9th, 1938. Klaus was working late in his laboratory when he heard the sounds. Glass shattering, people screaming. He walked to the window and looked out at the streets of Munich. Below him, Nazi brownshirts were dragging his neighbors from their homes. Men, women, children. People he had known his entire life. The baker who made his morning bread. The tailor who had fitted him for his wedding suit. The elderly professor who had taught him mathematics as a boy. They were being loaded onto trucks, beaten with clubs. Their shops and homes were burning. Klaus watched as they took Mrs. Goldstein from the apartment across the street. She was 73 years old. She had given Klaus candy when he was a child. A brown shirt knocked her to the ground with the butt of his rifle. She did not get up. That night, Klaus made a decision. He returned to his laboratory. He gathered every blueprint, every design document, every note he had ever made about his cooling systems. He stuffed them into an old leather suitcase that had belonged to his father. Then he walked out of the BMW facility for the last time. He did not go home. He knew they would come for him eventually. His mother's blood was a death sentence that had merely been postponed. Instead, he went to the train station. He bought a ticket to Zurich. And when the border guards asked why a senior BMW engineer was leaving Germany with a suitcase full of technical documents, he told them he was attending a conference. They believed him. They had no reason not to. Klaus Hartmann was a German hero. Why would a German hero run away? The journey from Munich to America took 4 years. Klaus spent 6 months in Switzerland, living in a boarding house in Zurich, trying to find a way to reach Allied territory. The Swiss were neutral, but they were also nervous. They did not want to anger their powerful German neighbors. When the Gestapo sent inquiries about a missing BMW engineer, the Swiss authorities politely suggested that Klaus find somewhere else to be. He went to Portugal next. Lisbon was full of refugees in those days. Jews, dissidents, artists, intellectuals. All the people that Hitler's Germany had decided were unworthy of life. Klaus lived in a tiny room above a fish market, surviving on savings that dwindled with each passing month. He applied for a visa to America. He was denied. He applied again. Denied again. The American consulate was overwhelmed with applications. Everyone wanted to escape to the land of the free. The waiting list was years long. Klaus tried Britain next, but Britain was under siege. The Blitz was raining bombs on London every night. They were not accepting refugees. He tried Canada. He tried Argentina. He tried Australia. Every door was closed. Finally, in 1941, he managed to get passage on a cargo ship to Brazil. From there, he made his way north through Central America, Mexico, and finally across the border into Texas. When Klaus Hartmann arrived in New York Harbor in May of 1942, he had been running for nearly 4 years. He had lost 30 pounds. His once fine suits were threadbare. His leather suitcase was battered and stained. But the documents inside were intact. The secrets of German engine technology carried across oceans and continents by a man who had given up everything. The Office of Strategic Services was waiting for him, and the OSS was America's wartime intelligence agency, the predecessor to the CIA. They had been tracking Klaus since he left Germany. They knew who he was. They knew what he knew. And they were very, very interested in talking to him. For over a year, the OSS debriefed Klaus in a series of safe houses across the eastern seaboard. They interrogated him about German aircraft production. They tested his knowledge against what they already knew. They verified his story through a dozen different channels. And they debated endlessly about whether they could trust him. Some argued that Klaus was a plant, a German agent sent to feed them false information. Why else would the Nazis let such a valuable engineer escape? It had to be a trap. Others pointed out that Klaus was half Jewish. The Nazis were not known for their tolerance toward Jews regardless of their usefulness. If Klaus had stayed in Germany, he would have ended up in a camp. Or worse. The debate raged for months. Meanwhile, Klaus sat in his safe house growing older and more desperate. He had come to America to help defeat the regime that had murdered his mother and destroyed his homeland. Instead, he was treated like a prisoner. Then my father heard about him. How my father learned of Klaus Hartmann's existence remains something of a mystery. The OSS operation was classified at the highest levels, but my father had connections throughout the military-industrial complex. He heard rumors, he asked questions, and eventually he discovered that the OSS was holding a German engineer who had designed the most advanced aircraft cooling systems in the world, the same cooling systems that my father's team had been struggling to develop for over a year. My father contacted General Morrison. He made his case with the same stubborn persistence that had gotten him everything else in his life. He needed Klaus Hartmann. The project needed Klaus Hartmann. America needed Klaus Hartmann. Morrison was skeptical, so was the OSS, so was everyone in Washington who knew about the situation. But my father would not give up. He traveled to Washington personally. He met with the OSS directors. He reviewed Klaus's file. He even asked to meet Klaus himself, which was denied. But he kept pushing. Finally, in May of 1943, the OSS agreed to a compromise. Klaus Hartmann would be transferred to the Chicago facility under strict supervision. He would be allowed to work on the 11-2220 project, but he would be watched constantly. Any sign of sabotage or espionage, and he would be arrested immediately. My father accepted the terms. On a warm afternoon in June 1943, a black government sedan pulled up to the gates of the Chrysler aircraft plant in Chicago. 2 OSS agents stepped out of the front, and from the back seat emerged a thin, tired-looking man in a worn gray suit carrying a battered leather suitcase. My father was waiting at the gate. This was unusual. Harold Mitchell was the chief engineer. He did not greet new employees personally. He barely greeted anyone personally. He was always too busy, too focused, too consumed by the endless problems of building an impossible engine. But for Klaus Hartmann, he made an exception. The two men stood facing each other for a long moment, the American and the German, the car maker and the aircraft engineer. Two men from different worlds brought together by war and desperation. My father extended his hand. "Dr. Hartmann, I have heard you are the best in Europe." Klaus looked at the hand, then at my father's face. His eyes were wary. He had been deceived too many times to trust easily. "I was the best. Now I am just a refugee. My father smiled. It was a rare expression on his face. He was not a man who smiled often. In America, nobody cares what you were. They only care what you will do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Klaus's eyes widen. A brand new safety helmet, white with the Chrysler logo printed on the front in blue and gold. This is yours now. You are part of my team. Klaus took the helmet. He turned it over in his hands, running his fingers across the smooth surface, tracing the unfamiliar logo. His jaw tightened. His eyes glistened. Many years later, Klaus told me about that moment. He said it was the first time in 6 years that he felt like he belonged somewhere. In Germany, they wanted to kill him. In Switzerland and Portugal, they wanted him gone. In OSS custody, they treated him like a specimen to be studied. But here in this dusty industrial facility in Chicago, a man he had never met handed him a helmet and said, "You are part of my team." Klaus looked up at my father. His voice was thick with emotion. Why, why would you trust me? I am German. I worked for them. My father's answer was simple, and it was the most American thing I have ever heard anyone say. Because everyone deserves a chance to start over. That is what this country is for. Klaus did not respond. He could not respond. He simply clutched the helmet to his chest and followed my father through the gates of the facility into a new life that he never could have imagined. But not everyone was as welcoming as my father. Standing at the entrance to the main engineering hall, watching the German approach with barely concealed hostility, was my brother Tom. Tom was 26 years old in 1943. He had my father's dark hair and my mother's blue eyes. He had graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in mechanical engineering, and he was one of the most talented young engineers on the project. He was also the most stubborn, most hot-headed, most fiercely patriotic person I have ever known. Tom had friends fighting in Europe. He had friends who had already died fighting the Germans, and now his father was bringing a German into their midst. When Klaus walked past him, Tom did not offer his hand. He did not nod. He did not acknowledge Klaus's existence at all. He simply stared with eyes full of cold fury. Klaus noticed. How could he not notice? But he said nothing. He had experienced worse. Much worse. That night, after Klaus had been shown to his quarters, and the OSS agents had established their surveillance protocols, Tom confronted our father in his office. I was there. I had started working as the project's documentary filmmaker a few months earlier. My job was to record everything for posterity, so I was always around, always watching, always filming. Sometimes people forgot I was there. Sometimes that was useful. Tom did not bother to close the door. His voice carried through the entire corridor. You cannot be serious. He is German. The Germans are killing Americans every single day. How do you know he is not a spy? My father looked up from his desk. His face was calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He had expected this confrontation. The OSS has vetted him for over a year, Tom. He is clean. The OSS. Tom spat the letters like they were poison. The same OSS that did not know Pearl Harbor was coming. The same OSS that has been wrong about everything since this war started. You are betting the entire project on their judgment. I am betting the project on my judgment. My father's voice hardened. And my judgment says that Klaus Hartmann is the best chance we have of making this engine work. We do not need him. Yes, we do. My father stood up and walked to a large table covered with technical drawings. He pulled out a folder and threw it down in front of Tom. The cooling system. We have been working on it for 14 months. We have tried 6 different designs. Every single one has failed. We are out of ideas. Tom stared at the folder. He knew what was in it. He had worked on 3 of those failed designs himself. Hartmann solved this problem in 1937. My father's voice softened slightly. He has the answer, Tom. He has had it for years. Without him, this engine will never fly. Tom was silent for a long moment. I could see the war playing out on his face. His hatred of Germans versus his love of the project. His suspicion of Klaus versus his trust in our father. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet but hard as steel. If he betrays us, I will kill him myself. He will not betray us. How do you know? My father walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and red. Because I have seen his file, Tom. I know what happened to his mother. I know what he lost. He turned back to face my brother. Klaus Hartmann did not escape Germany because he loves America. He escaped because Germany murdered everyone he loved. He hates the Nazis more than you do, more than any of us do, because for him, it is personal. Tom said nothing. He picked up the folder, stared at it for a long moment, then dropped it back on the table. Fine, but I am watching him every second of every day. He walked out without another word. My father sighed heavily. He suddenly looked very old. I stopped the camera. This seemed like a private moment. Dad, I said softly, do you really trust him, the German? My father looked at me. His eyes were tired but certain. Jimmy, let me tell you something about trust. You cannot earn it by asking for it. You can only earn it by deserving it. Klaus Hartmann has not earned our trust yet, but he deserves the chance to Joromai. He put his hand on my shoulder. That is what America is supposed to be. A place where everyone gets a chance, even the people we think are our enemies. I did not fully understand what he meant that night. I was only 17. I still saw the world in black and white, good guys and bad guys, Americans and Germans, us and them. But over the next 18 months, Klaus Hartmann would teach me that the world is far more complicated than that. He would teach me that enemies can become family, that strangers can become brothers, that a man without a country can find a home in the most unexpected place. And it all started with a plate of bacon. But that story would have to wait until Sunday morning. The first months of Klaus Hartmann's time at the Chicago facility were defined by one word: loneliness. He arrived at the plant every morning at 6 o'clock before anyone else. He stayed until 10 at night, long after everyone else had gone home. In between, he worked with a focus and intensity that bordered on obsession. He spoke only when spoken to. He ate his meals alone in a corner of the cafeteria. He walked through the corridors like a ghost present, but invisible there, but not truly there. The other engineers did not know what to make of him. Some were openly hostile. They had brothers and sons fighting in Europe. Every German was the enemy, regardless of circumstances. They muttered under their breath when Klaus walked past. They left the room when he entered. They made sure he knew in 1,000 small ways that he was not welcome. Others were simply indifferent. The project was too important, though, the work too demanding to waste energy on personal feelings. They acknowledged Klaus's expertise because they had no choice. His designs were brilliant. His solutions to problems that had stumped them for months were elegant and effective. But they did not invite him to join their conversations. They did not ask about his life. They treated him as a tool, useful but not human. Only my father made an effort to include Klaus in the social fabric of the team. He invited Klaus to meetings. He asked for his opinions in front of everyone. He made a point of calling him by his first name, not Dr. Hartmann, not the German, but Klaus, as if he were any other member of the team. But my father was the chief engineer. He had 1,000 responsibilities pulling him in 1,000 directions. He could not be Klaus's friend. He could only be his advocate. So Klaus remained alone. He lived in a small rented room on the second floor of a boarding house owned by an Irish widow named Mrs. O'Brien. The house was on a quiet street about 2 miles from the factory. It had creaky wooden floors, thin walls, and a bathroom shared by 6 tenants. Mrs. O'Brien had initially refused to rent to Klaus. When my father called to arrange the accommodation, she had listened politely until he mentioned the word German. Then her voice turned cold. I lost my nephew at Dunkirk, Mr. Mitchell. I will not have a German under my roof. My father had to use all his powers of persuasion. He explained that Klaus was a refugee, not a Nazi. He explained that Klaus's mother had been murdered by the very regime that Mrs. O'Brien despised. He explained that Klaus had given up everything to escape Hitler's Germany and help America win the war. Finally, reluctantly, Mrs. O'Brien agreed, but she made her feelings clear to Klaus from the moment he arrived. You stay in your room. You do not use the parlor. You do not speak to the other tenants. You pay your rent on time and you keep to yourself. Those are my rules. Klaus accepted the terms without argument. He was used to being unwanted. At least here, no one was trying to kill him. His room was small, a single bed with a thin mattress, a wooden desk and chair, a wardrobe that had seen better days, one window that looked out onto the street below. The walls were bare except for a single nail where a previous tenant had hung something long since removed. Klaus had few possessions. His battered leather suitcase, now empty of documents since he had handed everything over to my father. A few changes of clothes, a razor and a comb, and one photograph. The photograph showed a woman in her 50s with dark hair and kind eyes. She was sitting in a garden surrounded by flowers, smiling at the camera. On the back, in faded handwriting, were the words, "To my Klaus, with all my love, Mother, 1936. Every night before he went to sleep, Klaus took out the photograph and looked at it. He did not cry. He had cried all his tears years ago. He simply looked, remembering holding on to the only piece of his past that he had left. I know about these nightly rituals because I witnessed one of them. It was late September 1943. I had stayed at the factory until after dark, helping organize some film reels in the storage room. By the time I left, it was nearly 11 o'clock. My route home took me past Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house. I was walking along the sidewalk when I noticed a light in one of the second-floor windows. Something made me stop and look up. Curiosity, perhaps. Or fate. Through the thin curtain, I could see a silhouette. A man sitting at a desk, hunched over something in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. I stood there in the darkness watching, and even though I could not see clearly, I knew who it was. I knew what he was holding. And I understood in that moment something that I had not understood before. Klaus Hartmann was not just a German engineer. He was not just a refugee. He was not just a tool to be used for the war effort. He was a man who had lost everything. His country, his career, his mother. Everything that had once given his life meaning had been stripped away. And now he sat alone in a tiny room in a foreign land, holding a photograph and weeping for a world that no longer existed. I did not tell anyone what I had seen. It felt too private, too sacred. But from that night on, I looked at Klaus differently. I began to see him not as the German, but as Klaus, a human being, a person with a story, a man who deserved compassion. I was not the only one whose perception was about to change. The Sunday breakfast that transformed everything took place in early October 1943. My father had never invited a colleague to our home for a meal. He kept his work life and his family life strictly separate. When he came home in the evenings, exhausted from 14-hour days at the factory, he wanted to forget about engines and blueprints and production schedules. He wanted to be a husband and father, not the chief engineer. But on that particular Saturday night, he told my mother that Klaus Hartmann would be joining us for breakfast the next morning. My mother, Eleanor, was a practical woman. She had been married to Harold Mitchell for 28 years. She had learned long ago not to question his decisions, but this was unusual enough that she raised an eyebrow. "The German engineer Harold, are you sure that is wise?" My father nodded. "He is alone, Eleanor. Completely alone. He has no family, no friends, no one to talk to outside of work. He is drowning." My mother considered this. Her heart was large enough to hold compassion even for a former enemy. That was one of the things my father loved about her. "Very well, I will make something special." And she did. When Klaus arrived at our house the next morning, he was wearing his best suit. It was the same gray suit he had worn when he first arrived in Chicago, now cleaned and pressed, but still showing signs of hard use. He carried a small bouquet of flowers that he had purchased from a street vendor. His hands were trembling as he handed them to my mother. "For you, Mrs. Mitchell. Thank you for having me." My mother took the flowers with a warm smile. She did not hesitate. She did not show any discomfort at having a German in her home. She simply said, "Please call me Eleanor. Come in, Klaus. Breakfast is almost ready." The dining room table was set with my mother's good china. The plates that only came out for Thanksgiving and Christmas were arranged on a white linen tablecloth. In the center of the table, a small vase held a few late-season flowers from our garden. And the food. My mother had outdone herself. Thick-cut bacon fried until crisp, glistening with rendered fat. Eggs cooked to perfection, the yolks still runny. Golden toast slathered with butter. Fresh baked biscuits with honey. A pot of strong coffee that filled the room with its rich aroma. And because my mother was nothing if not thorough, a small pitcher of fresh, squeezed orange juice. Klaus stood in the doorway of the dining room, staring at the table. His eyes moved from dish to dish, taking in the abundance, the variety, the sheer excess of it all. My father guided him to a chair. Tom was already seated across the table, his face carefully neutral. I sat next to Tom, trying to gauge his mood. My mother took her place at the foot of the table opposite my father at the head. Please, my father said. Help yourself. Klaus sat down slowly. He looked at the plate of bacon, then at the eggs, then at the biscuits. His hands hovered uncertainly over the table as if he did not know where to begin. Finally, he reached for a strip of bacon. He brought it to his plate. He cut a small piece with his knife and fork, and he put it in his mouth. What happened next is something I will never forget. Klaus stopped chewing. His eyes widened. He looked down at the bacon on his plate, then back up at my father, then at my mother. His expression was one of pure astonishment. This is bacon. My mother nodded. Yes. Is something wrong? Klaus shook his head slowly. He took another bite, then another. He closed his eyes as he chewed, and I saw something extraordinary. A single tear rolled down his cheek. In Germany, he said quietly, we did not have meat like this, even before the war. This is something I only read about in books. He looked around the table at each of us in turn. His voice was thick with emotion. Why are you kind to me? I am the enemy. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother's eyes glistened. My father set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. You are not our enemy, Klaus. Hitler is the enemy. The Nazi Party is the enemy. But you are just a man looking for a home. And in America, everyone can find a home. Klaus did not respond. He could not respond. He bowed his head, and I saw his shoulders begin to shake. The tears came freely now, dropping onto the plate of bacon and eggs that had triggered this emotional release. My mother did something then that surprised all of us. She stood up, walked around the table, and put her arms around Klaus. She held him like she would hold one of her own sons. She did not say anything. She did not need to. It is all right, she finally whispered. You are safe now. You are among friends. Klaus wept openly. All the grief and fear and loneliness that he had held inside for years came pouring out. He cried for his mother. He cried for his lost homeland. He cried for the years of running and hiding and being treated as less than human. And we let him cry. We did not look away. We did not pretend it was not happening. We sat there with him, sharing his pain, offering what comfort we could with our presence. When he finally composed himself, Klaus looked up at my mother with red-rimmed eyes. Thank you, he said. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. My mother patted his shoulder and returned to her seat. She picked up the plate of bacon and held it out to Klaus. Now eat. There is plenty more where that came from. Klaus laughed. It was a wet, broken laugh, but it was genuine. The first genuine laugh I had ever heard from him. He ate. We all ate. And as the meal continued, something shifted in the room. The tension that had been present since Klaus arrived began to dissolve. My father asked Klaus about his childhood in Munich. My mother asked about German cooking. Even Tom, despite his best efforts to remain aloof, found himself drawn into a conversation about engine design. By the time the meal was over, Klaus Hartmann was no longer the German. He was simply Klaus, a colleague, a guest, a friend. After that Sunday breakfast, everything changed. Klaus stopped arriving at the factory before everyone else. Instead, he walked in with the rest of the team, greeting people by name, asking about their weekends, sharing small talk over morning coffee. He stopped eating alone in the corner of the cafeteria. Other engineers began to sit with him, curious about his experiences in Germany, eager to learn from his expertise. He told stories about the early days of BMW, about the challenges of building engines in pre-war Europe, about the technological advances that the Germans had made. He was careful never to glorify the Nazi regime. He always made clear that the engineers were not the same as the politicians. But he shared his knowledge generously, and in doing so he earned respect. He even stopped being invisible to Mrs. O'Brien. One evening, about a week after the breakfast at our house, Klaus returned to his boarding room to find a plate of cookies outside his door. There was no note, but he knew who had left them. The next morning, he knocked on Mrs. O'Brien's kitchen door and thanked her. She huffed and said it was nothing, just leftovers she did not want to throw away. But the following week, there was another plate. And the week after that, she invited him to join her for tea in the parlor. I will never know exactly what changed Mrs. O'Brien's mind. Perhaps it was something my father said to her. Perhaps she simply observed Klaus over time and realized that he was not the monster she had imagined. Perhaps she recognized in him the same loneliness that she herself felt, a widow living alone in a house full of strangers. Whatever the reason, Klaus Hartmann slowly began to build a life in America. Not a complete life, not yet, but the beginning of one. a foundation upon which something greater could be built. The work on the 11th 2220 accelerated dramatically once Klaus joined the core engineering team. The engine was everything they had designed it to be. Massive, powerful, revolutionary. No one had ever built anything like it for an aircraft. The challenges were immense. The engine generated so much heat that conventional cooling systems were inadequate. The fuel delivery had to be precisely calibrated for high-altitude operation. The ignition timing had to account for atmospheric pressure changes that would have negligible effects on a car engine, but could cause catastrophic failures in a plane. Klaus attacked these problems with a combination of German precision and newfound American optimism. His cooling system, designed the one he had carried in his leather suitcase across 2 continents, proved to be even better than my father had hoped. It used a network of small tubes carrying ethylene glycol through the engine block, removing heat with remarkable efficiency. But there was another problem that Klaus could not solve with engineering alone. Someone was trying to sabotage the project. It started with small things, tools going missing, parts that had passed inspection failing during assembly, calculations that had been verified somehow containing errors when they reached the machine floor. At first, everyone assumed it was normal production issues. New projects always had teething problems. But as the incidents accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. The problems were too consistent, too targeted to be coincidental. My father suspected sabotage but could not prove it. He increased security. He instituted new verification procedures. He had every part double-checked before installation. But the problems continued. The breakthrough came in November 1943 during the first full power test of the engine. The test stand was a massive concrete structure designed to contain the engine if something went wrong. Thick walls reinforced ceiling, blast-proof observation windows. My father had insisted on building it after reading reports of test failures at other facilities. The day of the test, the entire team gathered in the observation room. My father stood at the control panel. Tom manned the instrumentation station. Klaus watched from behind the glass, his face tight with anticipation. I stood in the corner with my camera filming everything. My father gave the signal. The technicians began the startup sequence. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The sound was incredible. A deep, thunderous rumble that vibrated through the floor and walls. The observation windows shook in their frames. I had to cover my ears against the noise. The gauges began to climb, 1,000 horsepower, 1,500, 2,000. The engine was performing beautifully. Then it reached 2,400 horsepower, 100 away from the goal, and the world exploded. The sound was different this time. A sharp crack followed by a screaming whistle. Smoke began pouring from one of the exhaust manifolds. Red warning lights flashed across the control panel. Emergency shutdown. My father's voice was calm but urgent. Kill the fuel. The technicians moved quickly, cutting power and fuel to the engine. The roar subsided to a rumble, then a growl, then silence. The smoke continued to billow through the test chamber. When the ventilation fans had cleared the air enough to see, we all stared at the engine in dismay. One of the coolant lines had ruptured. Ethylene glycol was leaking across the test stand, mixing with oil and fuel to create a dangerous slurry. Stay back, my father ordered. Let it cool before we inspect. But Klaus was not listening. Before anyone could stop him, he pushed through the observation room door and ran toward the smoking engine. Klaus, my father shouted, stop, it is too dangerous. Klaus ignored him. He grabbed a wrench from a tool cart and plunged into the smoke. We lost sight of him almost immediately. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The smoke was still thick. The engine was still hissing and popping as hot metal cooled. Then Klaus emerged. His face was black with soot. His hands were blistered from touching hot metal. But he was holding something up like a trophy, a section of ruptured pipe. He walked to my father and held it out. Look at this. My father took the pipe. He turned it over in his hands, examining the break point. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to cold fury. This is not aircraft-grade steel. This is standard industrial steel with a coating to make it look like the real thing. He looked up at Klaus. Someone switched the materials. Klaus nodded. I suspected for weeks, but I needed proof. He pointed at the pipe. Look at the manufacturer's mark. It is partially ground away, but you can still see it. Davidson Steel. My father's jaw tightened. Davidson Steel was one of their suppliers. They had been recommended by Colonel Victor Hayes, the military liaison officer assigned to oversee the project. Who approved this shipment? Klaus met my father's eyes. I think you already know. The investigation that followed was swift and decisive. My father and Klaus worked through the night examining every piece of material that had come from Davidson Steel. They found dozens of substitutions, standard steel marked as aircraft grade, substandard alloys labeled as premium, inferior parts hidden among legitimate supplies. The sabotage had been going on for months. If the test had been conducted at higher power levels, or if the engine had been installed in an aircraft, the results could have been catastrophic. Pilots could have died. My father brought his findings to General Morrison the next morning. The evidence was irrefutable. Colonel Hayes had been receiving payments from competitors who wanted the project to fail. He had used his position to introduce a compromised supplier into the chain. Morrison was furious. Hayes was arrested within the week, transported to Washington for a military tribunal. He would eventually be convicted of sabotage and treason, sentenced to 20 years in a military prison. But for our team, the important thing was that the sabotage had been stopped, thanks to Klaus. Tom came to Klaus's workshop late that evening. I was there organizing film canisters when he walked in. Klaus looked up from his desk. His hands were bandaged from the burns he had sustained during his inspection of the damaged engine. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. Tom stood in the doorway, not coming closer but not leaving either. You could have been killed. Klaus shrugged. The engine is more important than me. Tom shook his head. No, that is not what I meant. He took a step into the room. You could have been killed, and you did it anyway. For us, for the project, for America. Klaus was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have never forgotten. I have already lost one country, Mr. Mitchell. I have already seen what happens when good people do nothing while evil men take control. I will not let that happen again. Not here. Not in the country that gave me a second chance. Tom stared at him for a long moment. I could see the walls he had built beginning to crumble. All the prejudice, all the suspicion, all the hatred he had carried since the day Klaus arrived. I was wrong about you, Tom said finally. I am sorry. He extended his hand. Klaus looked at the offered hand. This was the same man who had refused to acknowledge his existence for months. The same man who had promised to kill him if he betrayed them. Now that man was offering friendship. Klaus took his hand. Apology accepted, Mr. Mitchell. Tom shook his head. Call me Tom. Klaus smiled. It was a small smile, tentative but real. Tom. From that night forward, everything was different between them. The cold hostility was replaced by mutual respect. The suspicion was replaced by trust. They began working together, spending long hours in the workshop, solving problems that had seemed unsolvable. I watched them from behind my camera, documenting the transformation. Two men from opposite sides of a global conflict finding common ground in their shared passion for engineering. It was, I think, the purest example of what this country stands for. The power of second chances. The ability to look past origins and see the person underneath. The belief that enemies can become friends, that strangers can become brothers. And the story was only beginning. The repairs to the engine took 3 weeks. New materials were sourced from verified suppliers. Every component was inspected, tested, and certified before installation. In December 1943, the 11-2220 ran at full power for the first time, 2,500 horsepower. The target had been achieved. My father stood in the observation room, watching the gauges, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. But there was still much work to be done. An engine on a test stand was one thing. An engine in an aircraft was another matter entirely. The next phase of the project would take them to Texas, to a dusty airfield in the middle of nowhere, to a cowboy who would teach Klaus what it truly meant to be free, and to a moment in the sky that none of us would ever forget. The project moved to Texas in June of 1944. The Chicago facility had served its purpose, but flight testing required open space, clear skies, and runways long enough to accommodate experimental aircraft. The Army Air Force had a base in West Texas that fit all those requirements. So we packed up our equipment, our documents, and our prototype engine and headed south. For Klaus, this journey was a revelation. He had seen New York Harbor when he first arrived in America. He had seen the industrial sprawl of Chicago. But he had never seen the American heartland. He had never seen Texas. We traveled by train, a journey of nearly 30 hours through the heart of the continent. Klaus sat by the window the entire time, watching the landscape transform from the gray cities of the Midwest to the green hills of Missouri to the endless golden plains of Oklahoma, and finally to the vast brown expanse of West Texas. I sat across from him for part of the journey. He barely spoke, but I could see the wonder in his eyes. Finally, somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, he broke his silence. "I have never seen so much space," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In Germany, everything is small. Villages pressed together. Farms divided into tiny plots. Every inch of land has been owned and fought over for 1,000 years." He gestured at the empty horizon stretching in every direction. "But here there is room for everyone. Room to grow. Room to dream." He turned to look at me. "Perhaps that is why Americans think big, because they have enough space to dream." I did not know what to say, so I just nodded and let him return to his window, watching the endless Texas sky. The Army Air Force Base was located near a small town called Midland. In 1944, Midland was little more than a cluster of buildings in the middle of nowhere. Cattle ranches, oil derricks, tumbleweeds rolling down empty streets. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers stood out like sore thumbs. We stood out, a team of engineers from Chicago accompanied by military personnel and one German refugee arriving in a town that had probably never seen a foreigner in its entire history. Word spread quickly. Within a week, everyone in Midland knew about the secret project at the airbase. They did not know the details, of course, but they knew something big was happening, and they knew there was a German involved. The reactions were mixed. Some people were hostile. We received angry letters at the base. A few local businesses refused to serve Klaus when he accompanied us into town. One man spat at his feet outside the general store. Klaus bore it all with quiet dignity. He had experienced worse. But not everyone was hostile. About 10 miles from the base, there was a cattle ranch owned by a man named Pete Henderson. Old Pete, everyone called him, though I never learned if he had a younger counterpart somewhere. He was 68 years old, lean and weathered as a fence post, with a white mustache and a battered Stetson hat that looked like it had been through every cattle drive since the Civil War. Old Pete was a real cowboy, not the movie kind, the working kind. He had been herding cattle across Texas since he was 12 years old. He had survived droughts, stampedes, rustlers, and 3 wives. Nothing surprised him anymore, except apparently Germans. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after we arrived, old Pete drove his truck up to the base and asked to see the man in charge. My father came out to meet him, expecting some kind of complaint. Instead, old Pete got right to the point. "Heard you got a German working for you." My father tensed. "That is correct." Old Pete nodded slowly. "Also heard he saved your whole project from some crooked army fella." "Word travels fast in Texas," my father said carefully. Old Pete smiled, revealing teeth stained brown from decades of chewing tobacco. "Son, word travels fast everywhere when the story is good enough." He adjusted his hat. "I did not come here to cause trouble. I came to invite your German to my ranch." My father blinked. "Excuse me." Old Pete jerked his thumb toward his truck. "Man comes all the way from Europe to help America win a war. Seems to me he deserves to see the real America. Not cities, not factories." He paused. "Texas." And so the following Sunday, Klaus Hartmann found himself standing in front of a 1,200-pound horse named Dusty, looking more terrified than I had ever seen him. "You ever ridden before?" old Pete asked. Klaus shook his head. "Never. Not once." Old Pete grinned. "Well, there is a first time for everything. Grab the horn there. Put your foot in the stirrup. And for God's sake, do not let go." What followed was 30 minutes of comedy that I wished I had captured on film. Klaus fell off twice. He nearly got his foot stuck in the stirrup once. He grabbed Dusty's mane so hard that the horse whinnied in protest. But old Pete was patient. He guided Klaus through every step, adjusting his posture, correcting his grip, encouraging him, with the calm persistence of a man who had taught hundreds of young cowboys the same skills. Finally, Klaus managed to stay mounted for a full circuit around the corral. Old Pete clapped his hands. "There you go. You are ridings now." He walked over and patted Klaus on the knee. "Does not matter where you come from. On the back of a horse, everyone is equal." Klaus looked down at him. His face was flushed with exertion, but there was something else there too. Something I had rarely seen. Joy. That evening, old Pete cooked us dinner. Not in his house. Outside under the vast Texas sky, with a fire pit dug into the red earth and a grill made from an old oil drum. He produced steaks the size of dinner plates cut from cattle he had raised himself. He grilled them over mesquite coals until they were charred on the outside and pink in the middle. There was no silverware, no fine china, just tin plates, cold beer, and the biggest pieces of meat I had ever seen. Klaus took his first bite and stopped chewing. "This is beef?" he asked, incredulous. Old Pete laughed. "Texas beef, son. Best in the world." Klaus took another bite, then another. He ate like a man who had been starving for years, which in a sense he had. When he finally finished, he set down his plate and looked at old Pete with something approaching reverence. In Germany, he said slowly, "We judge men by their family name, by their religion, by where they were born and who their parents were." He shook his head. "But here a cowboy I have never met invites a German Jew to his ranch, teaches him to ride, feeds him steak." He paused. "America is a miracle." Old Pete took a long sip of his beer. "America is just people, son. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between." He looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "But I will tell you what makes this place different. Here you get to choose who you want to be. Your past does not own you. Your blood does not define you." He turned to Klaus. "You came here as a German, but you can leave here as an American. If that is what you want." Klaus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "That is what I want, more than anything." Old Pete nodded, then welcome home. December 15th, 1944. I remember that date like I remember my own birthday. It was the day that everything we had worked for finally became real. The 11-2220 engine had been installed in a modified P-47 Thunderbolt designated XP-47H. The aircraft had been stripped down and rebuilt specifically to accommodate our monster of an engine. New cooling ducts, reinforced engine mounts, extended fuel tanks. Every system had been tested and retested 100 times. Now it was time to fly. The pilot chosen for this historic mission was Captain Jack Sullivan. Everyone called him Tex, partly because he was from Texas and partly because he looked like he had stepped out of a Western movie. 34 years old, square-jawed with a drawl so thick you could pour it over pancakes. Before the war, he had been a rodeo rider and crop duster. Now he was one of the best test pilots in the Army Air Force. Tex was not afraid of anything, or if he was, he never showed it. His wife Mary had come to the base for the flight. She was 30 years old with auburn hair and freckles across her nose, and she was 7 months pregnant with their first child. She stood at the edge of the runway, one hand on her swollen belly, watching as her husband prepared to climb into an untested aircraft with an experimental engine. I positioned myself nearby with my camera. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment we had all been waiting for. Tex walked toward the aircraft parachute slung over his shoulder helmet in hand. He stopped when he reached Mary. She looked up at him with eyes that held fear and pride in equal measure. "You promised me you would come back," she said. Tex smiled and took her hands. "Darling, I have flown through flak over Germany in planes held together with spit and prayers. Today I have got the best engine ever built." He glanced over at where my father and Klaus stood watching. "And I trust the men who built it." He kissed her then, a long kiss, the kind of kiss that says everything words cannot express. Then he turned and walked toward the aircraft. My father and Klaus met him at the base of the ladder. My father shook his hand first. "Good luck, Captain. Bring her home safe." Tex grinned. "That is the plan, Mr. Mitchell." Then he turned to Klaus. The two men looked at each other for a moment. "Dr. Hartman," Tex said, "I have flown a lot of engines." "Right. Pratt and Whitney, Rolls-Royce," he paused. "But I have never flown anything like this. If this bird performs half as well as you say she will, it is going to be the ride of my life." Klaus nodded. His face was pale with anxiety, but his voice was steady. "She will perform, Captain. I give you my word." Tex clapped him on the shoulder. "That is good enough for me." He climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. Ground crew swarmed around the aircraft performing final checks. Someone handed Tex his flight checklist. Someone else connected his radio headset. And then the moment of truth. The engine startup sequence began. I had heard the 11-2220 run dozens of times on the test stand, but hearing it come to life inside an actual aircraft was something else entirely. The sound built gradually from a low rumble to a thunderous roar that shook the ground beneath my feet. The propeller began to spin slowly at first, then faster and faster until it became an invisible blur. Klaus stood beside my father, his eyes fixed on the aircraft. His lips were moving. I think he was praying. The radio crackled. Tex's voice came through, calm and professional. "Control, this is Eagle 1. Engine is running smooth. All systems nominal. Requesting permission to taxi. Permission granted, Eagle 1. You are cleared for runway 27. The XP-47H began to move. It rolled slowly at first, following the taxiway toward the main runway. The engine note changed as Tex adjusted the throttle, a deep growl that promised incredible power waiting to be unleashed. Mary had her hands clasped in front of her chest. Her lips were moving too. I do not think she was praying. I think she was talking to her husband, telling him she loved him, telling him to come home. The aircraft reached the runway and turned to face the long strip of concrete stretching toward the horizon. Tex's voice came through the radio again. "Control, Eagle 1 is in position. Ready for takeoff." My father picked up the radio microphone. His hand was trembling slightly. "Eagle 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." There was a moment of silence. Then the engine roar intensified to a scream. The aircraft lurched forward, accelerating faster than any propeller plane I had ever seen. 50 miles per hour, 80, 100, 120. The nose lifted, and then the XP-47H was airborne. I tracked it with my camera as it climbed into the blue Texas sky, leaving a trail of white exhaust behind it like a brushstroke painted across the heavens. It climbed higher and higher, shrinking from a roaring beast into a silver speck, then disappearing entirely into the sun. For 45 minutes we waited. We listened to the radio chatter as Tex put the aircraft through its paces. Speed tests, climb tests, maneuverability tests. His voice remained calm throughout, but I could hear the excitement underneath. "This bird is incredible," he reported at one point. "She handles like a dream. Fastest thing I have ever flown." My father allowed himself a small smile. Klaus had tears streaming down his face, though he made no move to wipe them away. Then finally the speck reappeared in the distance, growing larger, taking shape, becoming an aircraft again. The XP-47H lined up with the runway and began its descent. Landing gear down, flaps extended, the engine throttled back to a gentle rumble. The wheels touched the concrete with a chirp of rubber. The aircraft rolled down the runway, slowing gradually until it came to a stop about 200 yards from where we stood. The engine shut down. The propeller spun to a halt. And then Tex was climbing out of the cockpit, pulling off his helmet, grinning like a man who had just touched the face of God. Mary was the first to reach him. She threw herself into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, mindful of her belly, laughing with pure joy. But then he set her down and walked toward my father and Klaus. His face was transformed. The casual cowboy confidence was still there, but underneath it was something deeper. "Oh, maybe. Or reverence." "Mr. Mitchell," he said. "Dr. Hartman." He shook their hands one after the other. "That is the finest aircraft I have ever flown. It is fast. It is powerful. It is responsive." He paused. "It is perfect." My father's voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you, Captain. That means more than you know." Tex nodded. Then he turned to Klaus. "Dr. Hartman, I do not know your whole story. I know you are German. I know some people have given you trouble for that. But I want you to know something." He put his hand on Klaus's shoulder. "Today, I trusted my life to an engine that you helped build, and that engine brought me home safe." He smiled. "As far as I am concerned, that makes you American." Klaus could not speak. He simply nodded, tears still flowing freely down his face. Tom had been standing apart from the group watching the reunion. He had worked on this project for 3 years. He had fought with Klaus, then fought alongside him. He had seen his suspicions proven wrong and his prejudices challenged. Now, as the celebration wound down, he walked over to where Klaus stood alone, looking up at the aircraft that carried their shared dream. "Klaus," Tom said, Klaus turned. I know we started badly, but I would like to think we have become something more than colleagues. Tom paused. I would like to think we have become brothers. Klaus studied him for a long moment. In Germany, he said, I lost a brother to the war. He was killed on the Eastern Front in 1942. Tom's face fell. I am sorry, I did not know. Klaus shook his head. Do not be sorry, be glad. Because today, I think I've found a new one. He clasped Tom's shoulder. You are family now, Tom Mitchell, whether you like it or not. Tom laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and genuine. I think I can live with that. I lowered my camera. Some moments are too sacred to record. Some bonds are too precious to document. Standing on that Texas runway under that endless blue sky, I watched my brother and a German refugee become brothers themselves. And I knew that whatever happened next, whatever the war brought, whatever the future held this moment, would last forever. The 11-2020 had flown, but something more important had taken flight as well. Hope. The months that followed the first flight were a blur of activity and triumph. Tex Sullivan flew the XP-47H 17 more times. Each flight confirmed what we already knew. The XI-2220 was the most powerful, most reliable piston aircraft engine ever built. It outperformed every expectation. It exceeded every specification. Reports went to Washington. Generals came to Texas to witness the flights firsthand. Photographers from military publications captured images of the sleek aircraft against the endless sky. Plans were drawn up for mass production. Contracts were prepared. The future seemed bright and certain. Klaus worked harder than ever. He refined the cooling system. He optimized the fuel delivery. He solved problems that arose during flight testing with the same brilliant efficiency that had made him famous in Germany. But there was something different about him now. A lightness that had not been there before. A sense of belonging. He came to Sunday dinners at our house whenever we were in Chicago. He played chess with my father in the evenings. He taught Tom German curse words which my mother pretended not to hear. He even started dating a young widow named Catherine, who worked as a secretary at the facility. For the first time in years, Klaus Hartmann had a life not just in existence. Then came August 1945. I remember exactly where I was when we heard the news. We were in the facility cafeteria eating lunch. Someone had left a radio playing in the corner. Most of us ignored it. We were too focused on our work, too caught up in our own little world of engines and blueprints and test flights. Then the announcer's voice cut through the noise. We interrupt this program to bring you a special bulletin. The Japanese government has announced its unconditional surrender. The war is over. I repeat, the war is over. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the cafeteria erupted. People were cheering, crying, hugging each other. Someone started singing, God Bless America. Tom grabbed the nearest person, who happened to be a 60-year-old machinist named Earl, and lifted him off the ground in a bear hug. I looked for Klaus. He was standing by the window alone, looking out at the Chicago skyline. His face was not joyful. It was something else. Something I could not quite read. I walked over to him. Klaus, are you all right? He did not turn around. The war is over, he said quietly. Germany is destroyed. Japan is destroyed. Millions of people are dead. He paused. And I do not know whether to celebrate or mourn. I did not know what to say. So I just stood there with him, watching the sun set over a world that had suddenly irrevocably changed. The celebration lasted 3 days. Then reality set in. My father was summoned to Washington for a meeting with General Morrison and several officials from the War Department. He took Tom with him. I stayed behind in Chicago organizing film reels and pretending that everything was normal. When they returned a week later, I knew immediately that something was wrong. My father looked 10 years older. Tom's face was pale and drawn. They gathered the senior staff in the main conference room and closed the doors. I slipped in with my camera, as I always did. Nobody stopped me. My father stood at the head of the table. He looked around at the faces of the men and women who had worked alongside him for 3 years. Engineers, machinists, technicians, people who had given everything to make the 11-20-20 a reality. Then he spoke. The project has been canceled. Silence. Someone finally asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why the engine works? It is perfect. We proved it. My father nodded slowly. Yes, We proved it. And that is precisely the problem. He walked to the window, his back to the room. The war is over. Military budgets are being slashed. Contracts are being canceled across the board. But more importantly, the world has changed. He turned back to face them. In Germany, our forces captured several advanced aircraft prototypes, aircraft powered by jet engines. They are faster than anything we have ever seen, faster than the XP-47H, faster than any propeller-driven aircraft could ever hope to be. He paused. The era of the piston engine is ending. The future belongs to jets. And the 11-2020, as magnificent as it is already obsolete. I watched the news sink in around the room. 3 years of work, 3 years of sacrifice, 3 years of blood and sweat and tears. All of it rendered meaningless by the march of technology. My father continued, the Army has decided that further development of the 11-2020 is not justified. The prototype will be preserved for historical purposes. The plans will be archived, and this facility will be closed by the end of the year. He looked around the room one last time. I am sorry, you all deserve better. Then he walked out. The room exploded into chaos, people shouting and people crying, people demanding answers that no one could give. I looked for Klaus. He was not there. I found him an hour later, sitting alone in his workshop. The room was dark except for a single lamp on his desk. He was holding something in his hands, the battered leather suitcase that had carried him across continents. I sat down across from him. Klaus, I am sorry. He did not look up. Do not be sorry, James. This is how the world works. Everything ends, everything changes. The only question is whether we change with it. He set down the suitcase. In 1938, I walked out of BMW with my life's work in this bag. I thought I had lost everything, but I was wrong. I had not lost everything. I had only lost one chapter. The next chapter was waiting to be written. He finally looked at me. This is the same. The 11-2220 is finished, but I am not. Your father is not. Tom is not. We will find new work, new challenges, new dreams. He smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was strength behind it. That is what America has taught me. In this country, endings are not failures. They are just beginnings in disguise. I did not know what to say, so I just sat with him in the darkness, two men mourning the death of a dream while somehow still believing in the future. 3 weeks later, Klaus received a visitor. The man arrived at the facility in a black government sedan, wearing a dark suit and carrying a briefcase. He asked to speak with Dr. Hartman privately. Klaus told me about the conversation afterward. The man was from the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. He explained that the American government was implementing something called Operation Paperclip, a program to bring German scientists and engineers to the United States. The goal was to prevent their expertise from falling into Soviet hands. The CIA wanted Klaus to participate, not as a recruit, but as a recruiter. They wanted him to return to Germany, identify former colleagues who might be valuable to America, and help bring them over. It was an incredible offer, high salary, important work, a chance to return to his homeland, even if only temporarily. There was just one problem. Germany was not his homeland anymore. America was. Klaus came to our house that evening. He sat down with my father, my mother, Tom, and me. He told us about the offer. Then he asked for our advice. My father spoke first. Klaus, this is an incredible opportunity. You would be doing important work for your country. Klaus nodded. My country? Yes, he paused. But which country is that? Tom leaned forward. What do you mean? Klaus looked around the table, at the faces of people who had become more than colleagues, more than friends. When I came to America, I was a refugee, a man without a home. But somewhere along the way, that changed. You gave me a home. Not just a place to live, but a family, a purpose, a reason to believe in something again. He turned to my mother. Mrs. Mitchell, you hugged me when I cried over a plate of bacon. You treated me like a son when I had no mother. He turned to my father. Mr. Mitchell, you gave me a chance when everyone else saw only an enemy. You trusted me when I did not even trust myself. He turned to Tom. Tom, you hated me, and then you became my brother. He turned to me. And James, you saw me at my lowest moment crying alone in a dark room, and you never told anyone. You let me keep my dignity. His voice cracked. How can I leave this? How can I go back to a country that murdered my mother, that destroyed everything I loved, when I have found a new family right here? The room was silent. Then my mother stood up. She walked around the table and put her hands on Klaus's shoulders. Klaus, she said softly, you do not have to go anywhere. You are home. Klaus broke down. For only the second time since I had known him, he wept openly. But these were not tears of grief. These were tears of joy. He stayed. The next morning, Klaus informed the CIA that he was declining their offer. He was an American now, and he intended to remain one. The CIA man was not happy. He argued. He threatened. He implied that refusing might have consequences. My father threw him out of the facility personally. Nobody threatens my family, he said as the sedan drove away. Klaus watched from the window, and for the first time he laughed. A real laugh, the laugh of a man who finally truly belonged. Klaus Hartmann became a United States citizen on July 4, 1950. The ceremony took place at the federal courthouse in Chicago. My whole family was there. My father and mother, Tom and his new wife Sarah, me and my girlfriend Betty, who would become my wife the following year. Even old Pete Henderson drove all the way from Texas to witness the moment. When the judge asked Klaus to raise his right hand and take the oath, his voice was steady and clear. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state or sovereignty, and particularly to Germany, of which I was formerly a subject. He paused. I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. When it was over, when the judge declared him a citizen, when the small crowd of family and friends applauded, Klaus stood there with tears streaming down his face. Tom was the first to shake his hand. Welcome home, brother. Klaus pulled him into a hug. I have been home for years, Tom. This just makes it official. After the ceremony, we went to our favorite restaurant for a celebration dinner. It was a small Italian place on the north side of Chicago. Red checkered tablecloths, candles and wine bottles. The kind of place that felt like family, even if you were not related to anyone there. Old Pete raised his glass. To Klaus Hartmann, who came to America as a stranger and leaves today as one of us. May he never forget that in this country, everyone gets to choose who they want to be. We all drank. Then, my father raised his glass. To the 11th 2020, the greatest engine that never was, and to the team that built it. May we always remember what we accomplished together. We drank again. Then Klaus raised his glass. To family, he said simply, the one we are born into, and the one we choose. That toast needed no explanation. We all understood. We all drank. And for one perfect evening, the past and the present and the future all seemed to merge into a single golden moment. The years that followed were kind to Klaus. He never returned to aircraft engines. That chapter was closed. Instead, he applied his talents to a different field, automotive engineering. He worked for Ford, then GM, then finally back at Chrysler, helping to design the engines that powered the great American automobiles of the 1950s and 1960s. He married Catherine in 1951. They never had children of their own, but they were godparents to Tom's 3 kids and my 2. Every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner, Klaus was there. Part of the family, part of the fabric of our lives. My father passed away in 1962. Heart attack. He died in his sleep peacefully at the age of 70. At his funeral, Klaus delivered the eulogy. Harold Mitchell gave me something that I can never repay, Klaus said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. He gave me a chance. In a world that saw only enemies and allies, he saw a human being. In a time of war, he chose compassion. In an age of suspicion, he chose trust. He looked out at the crowd of family and friends. I hope that when I die, someone will say the same about me, that I gave someone a chance, that I saw the person, not the label, that I chose love over fear. He paused. That is what Harold taught me. That is what America taught me. And that is what I will carry with me until the day I join him. My mother followed my father 4 years later. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years before finally letting go. On her last day, Klaus sat by her bedside, holding her hand, telling her stories about Germany and Texas and everything in between. She smiled at him. Klaus, she whispered, Promise me you will keep coming to Sunday dinners. The family needs you. I promise, Mrs. Mitchell. She shook her head. Call me Eleanor. Those were her last words. She passed that night surrounded by everyone she loved. Tom kept the tradition of Sunday dinners going. Every week without fail, the extended Mitchell family gathered at his house, and every week without fail, Klaus was there. In 1970, Klaus was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors gave him 2 years. He lasted 3. I visited him often during those final months. He had moved into a small apartment near Tom's house so the family could care for him. His body was failing, but his mind remained sharp. One evening about a month before the end, I sat with him as the sun set outside his window. He was weak, barely able to speak above a whisper, but he wanted to talk. James, he said, do you still have those films, the ones you took during the war? I nodded. I have them all. Good, he smiled. Someday you should show them to people. Tell them our story. I will, Klaus, I promise. He was quiet for a moment. I have had a good life, James. Better than I ever expected. Better than I deserved. That is not true, Klaus. You deserved everything you got. He shook his head. No one deserves anything. We are all just lucky. Lucky to be born. Lucky to survive. Lucky to find people who love us. He reached out and took my hand. I was lucky to find your family. Lucky to find America. Lucky to have a second chance. Tears were streaming down my face. We were lucky to find you, Klaus. He smiled, that sad, beautiful smile that I had come to know so well. Then I guess we were all lucky together. Klaus Hartmann died on March 15, 1973. He was 81 years old. The funeral was held at the same church where my parents had been married, where Tom had been married, where I had been married. It was standing room only. Engineers, neighbors, friends, family. People whose lives Klaus had touched over 30 years in America. Tom delivered the eulogy. He stood at the pulpit, gray-haired now, his voice cracking with emotion. Klaus Hartmann came to America as an enemy, he said. He came as a German, as a Jew, as a refugee from a regime that had murdered his mother and destroyed his world. He paused, but he did not stay an enemy. He became a colleague, a friend, a brother, a son. He looked out at the congregation. He taught us that nationality is an accident of birth, but character is a choice. He taught us that the past does not have to define the future. He taught us that family is not just blood. Family is the people who choose to love you. He took a deep breath. Klaus used to say that America was a miracle, but I think he was wrong. America is not a miracle. America is a promise that anyone from anywhere can find a home here, a promise that enemies can become friends, a promise that strangers can become brothers. He looked at the casket draped in an American flag. Klaus kept that promise. He honored it every day of his life, and now it is up to us to keep it for him. He stepped down from the pulpit. The congregation was silent except for the sound of weeping. Then slowly someone started to sing. Amazing Grace. One voice at first, then two, then the whole church. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Klaus would have liked that. I'm an old man now. I have seen wars begin and end. I have seen technologies rise and fall. I have seen the world transform in ways that Klaus and my father could never have imagined. But some things remain constant. Family, love, the promise of America. I came to this museum tonight to remember, to honor the men and women who built the 11-2020, to honor my father who dared to dream, to honor my brother Tom who learned to see past his prejudices, to honor Klaus who taught us all what it means to find a home. The engine is still here behind this glass, a relic of a war that ended before I grew old. Most visitors walk past without a second glance. They do not know what it represents. They do not know the sacrifices that were made, the barriers that were broken, the bridges that were built. But I know, and now you know too. James Mitchell stands slowly, his joints protesting the movement. He turns off the tape recorder and slips it back into his pocket. Outside the window, snow continues to fall on Washington, D.C. Christmas lights twinkle in the distance. Somewhere families are gathering for holiday dinners, sharing meals and stories and laughter. Just like we used to do. Just like Klaus taught us to do. James touches the glass one last time, leaving a faint fingerprint on the surface. Goodbye, old friend, he whispers. Thank you for teaching me what home really means. Then he turns and walks slowly toward the exit, leaving behind the engine, the memories and the story of a German refugee who found a family in America. The security guard nods as he passes. Good night, Mr. Mitchell. Merry Christmas. James smiles. Merry Christmas, and thank you for letting me have this time. The guard shrugs. It is the least we can do, sir. That plaque says your family built something important. Figured you deserved a moment alone with it. James pauses at the door. That plaque tells part of the story, he says. But the most important part is not about engines. It is about people, about second chances, about what America is supposed to mean. He steps out into the cold December night. The snow falls softly around him. The city glitters with lights. And somewhere in a small house in Chicago, a family is gathering for Sunday dinner, keeping a promise that was made decades ago by a German refugee who found a home. The story of the 11th 2020 ended long ago. But the story of Klaus Hartmann and the family who loved him will never end. Because some stories are not about machines, they are about hope, and hope never dies.